So you can see my title, and there will be occasional titles along the way, subtitles. Around 1968, when others were erecting barricades in Morningside Heights or on the left bank of the Seine, I was in a library carrel in New Haven trying to think of a dissertation topic, equally revolutionary activity. I liked Spencer a lot, so I thought I would write a dissertation about the Fairy Queen. I had a general sort of intuition that his poetic allegoric method involved the disposition of larger things into many facets of smaller things. In my mind, and I put it that way because this particular dissertation never got written, I called this method prismatic. And I felt I had a triumphant confirmation of my critical insight in the words of the poem itself when I read the proem to Book 3, in which Spencer addresses Queen Elizabeth and promises her that he will enable her, and I quote, "in mirrors more than one, herself to see," unquote. I chose to begin work with a close reading of the episode in Book 2, the Book of Temperance, when Spencer's hero Guyon travels through the castle of Alma, which turns out to be a giant allegorical version of the human body, a sort of Elizabethan visible man toy. Now, in my effort to be a scholar as well as a close reader, I decided that I had better find the scholarly volume, surely there had to be one, which did full court press on the subject of the human body as microcosm. I needed that book badly, since I was damned if I was going to do my own extensive research into the primary materials for a payoff that at most would illuminate 1/3 of one of my chapters. Yet after a few months of this, I realized A, that there was no such book, B, that willy-nilly I was on my way to collecting the relevant materials, and C, that I'd better write that book. I've always told this story in the key of triumph, about what it means to find one's subject, the more serendipitously the better, and to locate that subject in such a way that it provides something the world demonstrably needs. And it doesn't escape my notice on the present occasion that I'm speaking to PhD students who can benefit from such a lesson. Be that as it may, I realized in the context of this conference that there was something less triumphant, a kind of counter-movement or regressiveness in my switch of topic. Those prisms, or mirrors more than one, that I had explored in my original prospectus, were by their very nature shifting, unstable, transient. Their effect, after all, was to take some larger entity and turn its seeming monumentality into a diversity of points of view, like the Queen's eye in Shakespeare's Richard II, which, glazed with blinding tears, divides one thing entire to many objects, like perspectives, which, rightly gazed upon, show nothing but confusion, at which point we Renaissance scholars immediately cue Holbein's ambassadors, with the anamorphosis, that sort of chewing gum smear at the bottom of the canvas, which you have to stand in one particular spot thoughtfully. There's a thoughtful X at the National Gallery in London that you line up to stand in to see that that's actually a skull. When I gravitated away from this kind of shimmering multiplicity into something more like the allegorical body, the eventual dissertation, along with the subsequently eventual book, Nature's Work of Art, The Human Body as Image of the World, it located its intellectual heart not so much in a site of transiency, but in a place where there are likelier to be fixed equations. Not that I was insensitive to this distinction as I actually wrote the book. I would have been a blockhead not to notice that the human body in, say, Donne's Devotions or Shakespeare's Coriolanus, or indeed the Fairy Queen itself, while it gets submitted to potentially rigidifying systems of allegorization, which in any case Angus Fletcher and Harry Berger had taught me to see as not so rigid after all, still, that it was at the same time a site. These were the site for all sorts of far less static experience. Now, if I oversimplify, it's to make a point about what happened next in my scholarly life. What left me unsatisfied in writing Nature's Work of Art, fortunately, since it impelled my next project, was a sense that something needed to be done about bodies that move. And not only bodies that experience straightforward locomotion, walking down the street, but bodies that are magically transformed into other bodies. Hence, the gods made flesh, metamorphosis in the pursuit of paganism. I tell this story as a ticket of entry to the present conference. Of course, I don't know why you invited me to be plenary speaker, haven't a clue, but I do find myself deeply and personally, as you can tell from my rather narcissistic choice of subject matter, summoned by many of the terms that you have used to frame the subject matters that are being addressed here. Transformation and translation, transience and transcendence, not to mention between or beyond. So to begin with, my story about an intellectual progression from a still body to a metamorphic body is intended as some sort of signpost. But there's another signpost that comes along with this glimpse into my past experience. When I now reread that crucial Spencer passage about mirrors more than one, which gave my dissertation its very temporary title, I discover intensely concentrated reference material to the visual arts. Portrait, portrayed, living art, life resembling pencil, zeuxis, praxiteles, portrait figure, colored shows, living colors, all of which completely escaped my notice when I was preparing to write my dissertation. Some years later, however, when my thinking had been charged through with what you're here calling in trans, that is, when I shifted my topic to metamorphosis, my sense of flux embraced not only a literary subject that was itself labile, but also a set of questions that went outside the literary. I came to feel that it would be absurd to talk about the purely textual aspect of the heritage of metamorphosis without reference to the visual aspect. And so I spent 10 years, 10 quiet years on the publishing front, on the tenure getting and publishing front, drop a little reality principle in there, making myself into an art historian, as well as a literary scholar. From there, another 10 years or so, calendar pages flip away, I felt the need to understand something more about the concreteness of the visual art project, which is another in-trans transformation, from 2 dimensions to 3, and from visual art to material art. And so I pursued archaeology. So the second signpost, then, is toward interdisciplinarity. And it provides my other answer, why I imagine you brought me here, or why for whatever, God only knows what reason you brought me here, what I'm going to do when I get here. If back in 1975, I was moving not only from static to mobile subject matters, but also from literary to visual methodologies, these particular instances of between and beyond, to use their lovely expression, became regular characteristics of my intellectual life. Indeed, even before I went from the castle of Alma to the heritage of Ovid, I had been seduced, or had seduced myself, into theater as an actor and director. And my next scholarly project, as I have intimated, has to do with, in a word, food. I'm looking at the cultural activities of eating and drinking, historically and especially on my usual historical beat of antiquity and the Renaissance, and I'm asking how they might be brought into the realm of the higher prestige arts like painting and poetry. Of course, it's not self-evident that the acquisition of whole new fields of data, say adding the Botticelli note cards to the Spencer note cards. I'm sure the expression note cards means anything to you, but they used to exist. And then topping them off with the latest pile, which is the banqueting note cards. I'm not sure this really counts as, again, to quote your conference materials, transformation and translation, transience and transcendence. Nor is it automatically the case that steeping oneself in different disciplines produces a guaranteed payoff of between and beyond. In my view, these moves become intellectually significant when one starts asking what sorts of harmonious interplay may exist between these alternatives. Words and pictures, play scripts and theatrical performances, the social text of the banquet and the actual substances consumed there, things like that. And perhaps, more importantly, to ask what sorts of frictions are involved in these encounters. Those are really the prisms, the mirrors more than one, that I've tried to explore by moving between and beyond disciplines. With all this in mind, I'm going to offer a series of characteristic vignettes, each a piece of work in progress, illustrating some of the range of my own in-trans work. My hope is not only that they exhibit efforts across different academic fields,